Do you ever wish you can get an inside look on how mainstream media works? And in addition to that, do you ever wish you could get a real clear picture on the anatomy of cancel culture when it happens to someone in the mainstream media? We see all these figures getting canceled all the time. Well, today I have the ability and the honor to speak to Danielle Smith, who is a journalist and was a radio host. She worked for Global News, and she didn't really get canceled per se. I mean, she got attacked a lot, but she voluntarily walked away from being a radio host after 6 years because she felt as though the Overton window had shifted so dramatically that it was only a matter of time. So her insight is really, really incredible, and I'm really excited to speak to her today. I hope you like this conversation. I know you will, actually. So please listen. My name is Angelo Sidoro, and this is Cancel This. All right, Danielle, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, my pleasure.
I was just saying before that you've basically partially inspired me to do what I'm doing. So I want to thank you for that. And, this is a sort of a big deal for me because I've been listening to you for a long time, particularly when you were on Global. And I know now that you're not on Global. So I was wondering if you could sort of retell that story in terms of your exit, because at least in my neck of the woods, that made waves that you sort of voluntarily exited the mainstream. And I know you're working on some other things now, but what happened there? I mean, you were a radio host and you chose to leave.
Yeah. Well, I hope you don't curse me after a period of time doing what you're doing, because I think what happened for me is it just seemed like the world of mainstream media was getting to be way too perilous. And for me, I think my initial concerns began when COVID hit. And I don't know what happened to the mainstream when COVID hit. I think part of it is that in broadcast media, because it's so heavily regulated by the CRTC and by government federal policy, I think that we're used to having emergency response where broadcast media plays a role in getting the government's message out. So you can think in a flood or an ice storm or a fire, you need to have broadcast media available to give people up-to-date information. And I suppose if COVID had only lasted as an emergency for 4 weeks, that would have been a legitimate role to play. But now that COVID has lasted for 14 months plus, I think it's irresponsible for the media, the mainstream media, not to be more critical. Our job in the mainstream media is not to be issuing government press releases and uncritically reporting government messaging. Our job in the mainstream media is to be the fourth estate. That's the purpose, is to challenge institutions, especially when the overwhelming evidence is emerging that lockdowns make no difference in the trajectory of this virus. You can just look at what happened in Florida, and Sweden, and South Dakota as examples. Maybe the counter examples are some of the heaviest lockdown states like New York or here, Quebec, had some of the worst results. So it's on its surface, that should be something that would have attracted the media's attention to find out why that was. Instead, the media acted as a bit of a dog pile on anyone who challenged the official line. And when it began, I think, to get really problematic, I think for me, the first concern I had was when I did a joking tweet about hydroxychloroquine and published a picture of me with a gin and tonic, because hydroxychloroquine is quinine is the main ingredient in that, and the British understood when they went to India it was a way to ward off malaria. So I made a joke about having a gin and tonic, and the Twitter world went crazy. And I think part of it was the hatred for Donald Trump. Part of it was this notion that if Donald Trump said something, the media had to prove him wrong. And I don't think that anybody has given a fair hearing on what has happened in the therapeutics world in treating COVID. So as I went along in the mainstream, especially on COVID coverage, I just had way too many guests and topics that were kibosh, probably 36 topics that I wasn't allowed to talk about. And to me, I felt like I was not serving my public. Is that to me, I think that there's a double answer. It's not just vaccines. Vaccines are important. But if you aren't vaccinated and you do get COVID, you need something better than go home, drink fluids, get bed rest, and hope you don't need to be hospitalized, because if you do, you'll probably end up on a ventilator and you might die. Like that, there's got to be something better in medical science than this binary idea that vaccines are the be all and end all. And I've just seen such an overt suppression campaign of any discussion, whether it's of steroids or hydroxychloroquine, zinc, azithromycin, or ivermectin. And that has me very troubled that the media is not playing a more proactive role in getting to the bottom of it. So I'll just say one more thing on that, because I think it's so important for this to get out, that Dr. Peter McCullough in Texas gave a presentation saying that if we had been using this combination of therapeutics from the beginning, we would have saved 85% of the lives that were lost. So this is not just an academic argument. It's a very serious one. And I think that the media has failed on that front. And I didn't want to be part of that anymore. So that was one issue. The other issue, though, is that part and parcel of the suppression that was going on was this new cancel culture that has emerged. And I've followed it over the years. I've seen people of the conservative side say that they were getting shadow banned or that they were losing their supporters. But I think when it began to be very serious for me is when James Bennett lost his position as the editorial page editor of the New York Times for doing something that would be a normal course of action, publishing a column from a senator on the issue of the riots that were taking place after mostly peaceful BLM protests by Antifa and Black Bloc burning the place down. And so to write a column saying maybe we need to bring the military in, normally in a normal world, you would have had a counterpoint to that. But he ended up losing his job over it. And then Jessica Mulrooney lost her position over some poorly worded text messages that she had back and forth with a person she thought was a friend. And then Wendy Mesley ended up getting deplatformed. And I just thought, wow, like if we end up in a situation where even progressives can't navigate this world without stepping in it, what hope is there for the rest of us? Because the real problem is there's no redemption. There's no point where you can apologize and come back. When you have stepped in a Twitter bomb and the Twitterverse decides to go crazy on you, your career's over. Your reputation's in ruins. And in the mainstream media, you don't have the luxury of just saying, see this really big issue that's going on today? I'm worried I'm going to misspeak and ruin my career. Therefore, I'm not going to talk about it today. You can't do that. You've got to deal with the issues as they come up. So I just felt like it was too perilous an environment to continue operating in. And when I couldn't get assurances that my bosses would stand by me in the event that there was another Twitter storm, I just felt like the best course of action for me was to find something else to do. So that's why I did it. And I hope one day we can get back to having a sense of goodwill that most of us are just trying to figure the world out. We use the wrong pronoun or we speak in the wrong way. It's not to be malicious. It's not to hurt somebody's feelings. It's not to create hate. It's really because some of the language is unfamiliar, and you have to allow people to make mistakes along the way, and you have to allow them to continue in the public sphere.
Well, and I imagine to some degree, especially with talk radio, you must have gone through some anxiety constantly trying to be careful what your words are. I mean, like the whole point is that it's sort of free flowing and, you're a human being. You might say something that is inaccurate or something that's, verboten culturally. But did you feel, at least towards the end, that sense of, man, I have to be really scripted here. Like I have to be really careful I don't say the wrong thing. Or, did you sort of exit before you were at that point where you were sort of self-censoring yourself?
You're so very right about that, because one of the things I loved about talk radio, and I was on for almost 6 years, but the first 5 years were fantastic, because I always felt like, because people know that you're in a medium that is live and you're unscripted, that you're in a conversation. And if you say something that is incorrect, well, then a caller will call in and say, "No, I don't think you've got that right." You can correct the record immediately, or a text will come in saying, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, that's dead wrong," and you can correct it. Or the next day, you can correct it. I always felt like that's part of the discussion that should take place in the print media world. It happens all the time. You get corrections and clarifications that get printed on page A2 the next day if somebody's made a mistake. So the idea that you can correct seems to me to be part of having a conversation. But when my colleague Ryan Jesperson got fired in September, and it was, I don't know all the reasons behind it, but it followed 13 seconds of on-air commentary that a local councillor ended up taking umbrage with. I just thought, wow, like when you're in this position and you're doing 3.5 hours of live radio a day, you're and 13 seconds are enough to get you pulled or disciplined. And you don't know when you're talking, you don't know exactly what's going to come out of your mouth next. It's just not the way the human brain works. When you're reading, that's one part of your brain that you use. When you're speaking, it's a different part of your brain. Sometimes you just don't know how words are going to come out and how you're going to piece thoughts together. And so, yeah, I wasn't sleeping at night for probably since March when I got my first letter of discipline. So I wasn't sleeping at night, and that's just not healthy. Like you have to be able to feel confident when you go on the air, because there's a sincerity factor that comes through too. If people feel like you're scripted or being dishonest, you're gonna lose your listenership. So I felt like it was important. And this was something in broadcasting that was always important to me. My husband was my first producer when I got into broadcast media, and he says people can see sincerity and you have to be who you are. And so if I couldn't do that anymore, it just wasn't fun. So now I sleep a whole lot better at night.
And now, I guess, since then, you've done a lot more independent things. I mean, I guess going back to that disciplinary thing, just to touch on that for a moment, can you elaborate on what that is exactly? So you get a letter that is based on someone complaining? Is it one caller that called in to complain about something? I mean, what is the ecology of that exactly,
Well,
that developed?
it is a bit of, so the two that were problematic for me were both based around my COVID coverage. And then I'd had a problem. I had interviewed Kaylin Ford 18 months before, and that kind of got thrown into the letter of discipline too. I'm not quite sure why that was, because I thought that issue was resolved. But in any case, the issue around the hydroxychloroquine tweet, it sounded, I think it was a couple thousand people tweeting and commenting on it on Twitter. That seemed to be the genesis of it. And one of my advertisers complained about it and pulled funding from my show. And then the next time it happened, I played a video from JP Sears, who's a satirist, who, it was just after the CDC stats came out, where they showed that most people who were dying with comorbidities, and there was only 6% of people who have died of COVID who are otherwise healthy people. I'd been reporting those stats in Alberta, because Alberta's been reporting that since about April. But I played this humorous 5-minute video, and that caused another advertiser to pull their funding. And so that's when I got the letter of discipline, basically saying that my way of doing my show was harming the brand of the company, and that I had to bring myself into alignment with their brand, otherwise we'd have to part ways. So you have to sort of make your own decisions about who you are. I was hired to be to produce the Danielle Smith show, not Danielle Smith presents the Chorus show. So the culture of the organization changed, and I'm not the type of person. I've never been in a unionized environment, so my approach is, if you have sort of a fundamental disagreement on the direction, especially when it's creative, especially when it's a matter of personal integrity, if it isn't a fit anymore, you've got to move. And so I decided to move. And the interesting part about being off the air for a couple of months. I mean, I chose the date of my departure because I was intending to go to Mexico. Little did I know that, that the government would cancel my trip. So I had to figure out something to do in the meantime. And there were all these wonderful opportunities to do alternative media. So I had a collaboration with Western Standard Online, where I was able to interview many of the guests that I had been unable to interview in mainstream. So that was really cathartic for me. I felt like I finally was able to get the full story on COVID out, and people can choose if they're going to educate themselves and be balanced about it, or not. I at least felt like I had done my part in making sure people understood that there was a legitimate therapeutics out there, that the people who are most at risk were those over 70 with pre-existing conditions, that lockdowns didn't work. So I felt like I got that out. But all of the other alternative media platforms that are out there, I've really begun to understand that what's happened is that people are just creating their own channels. If they can't feel like they're getting their views expressed fairly or in a balanced way from mainstream media, then they're just taking to their own channels to do it. And it's never been easier to do. It's actually shocking to me I mean, you use Zencaster to do this interview. I've used StreamYard to do interviews. Zoom is also one. It doesn't look as great, but you can do after the fact manipulation of it to make sure that it looks professional. And these are really cheap platforms. And so I'm looking at this thinking, if anyone can get a decent camera and a decent mic, and it's this easy for us to be able to do a long form interview, that's going to fundamentally disrupt the traditional broadcast and television media. The amount of money invested in just the capital infrastructure of that, I don't know that it's sustainable. So there's going to be a major change in the media landscape over the next 10 years. I'll be watching it very closely to see how it ends up all shaking out. But it seems to me people like long form interviews. People like talking about real things. People like investigative research and being able to talk to unconventional voices. And all of that is flourishing in the alternative media. I think the mainstream is really missing out by getting narrower and narrower and narrower in the viewpoints they're willing to broadcast. And I think ultimately it's going to be the demise of a lot of these agencies.
But I mean, jumping right back into it, you're talking about going independent. It's never been easier. I mean, Zencaster is what, $20 a month. Even setting up a website, you buy a WordPress website, start your own outlet. It's incredibly easy, right? So
Hmm.
I do think we've moved towards this new world now where people are choosing to subscribe to people. I've noticed that happen a little more. And I've noticed these sort of newer outlets. I mean, look, I'm part of what you call an alt media outlet. But part of that is sort of a divisiveness that exists now where you have the mainstream media in Canada and you have alternative media in Canada that is really disliked by the mainstream media. And, we're never going to be taken seriously. I mean, to give you an idea, I'm in Vancouver, so I'm in the belly of the beast. And there's no way, like, any mainstream journalist in the city would ever consider me a real journalist, right? We're all like rage merchants. We're just bloggers, right? So I think that sort of bourgeois nobility still exists with mainstream media. But it seems to be, I mean, would you agree that like mainstream media is sort of dying?
The mainstream media is in real trouble, and it was it's funny, I keep entering media at exactly the wrong time. So I entered print media in back in the late 90s, and that's when blogs were all the rage. And so they started hacking away at their columnist and editorial budgets, because why would you pay for a newspaper to get that when you could get it for free online? And so the equivalent happened when I entered into broadcast media again. That was really, I think of Rebel Media as having been the media agency that really created the model in Canada for radio and television. And I think here's part of the problem for alt media is that the issue of trying to build your subscriber base comes down to putting out stories that will require people to click through the stories and watch them. That's sort of the model. And so there can be, if you're not careful, a tendency towards doing clickbait, right? Where you
Yeah.
just do stories from one perspective with the sole purpose of racking up the likes. That's the danger that can happen. But I think that's changing, really. When you look at, say, the other side of it, and I'll look at Canada Lens as an example, that would we even be talking about We Charity if they hadn't been bird dogging that issue for a year and doing the work that they did? It was even remarkable when the story did break, how the mainstream media would say, "News has broken that." And so Jesse Brown, I would watch his Twitter feed. He said, "No, news just doesn't break itself. Give us credit, dudes." And I think finally he did end up getting them to give him credit on a number of it. But that to me is the beautiful way in which alternative media and mainstream media can work together. Because I don't know that anyone could have found that story if it hadn't been Canada Lands, but turning it into a major issue for the government That needed the mainstream media to take it seriously and to report on it the way they did. And I think that once the story was broken by Canada Lands, the mainstream media did their job. So I've always paid attention to what happens in the alt media, and I'll give credit on the other side to Ezra Levant. Would we have known that the government of Canada was allowing Chinese soldiers to train and monitor our exercises if he hadn't been writing about that? I'm sure Post Millennial is in the same position where it's broken stories that ended up getting picked up by the mainstream media. True North has as well, and so to me, that's the beauty, is that it really should work together. That there should be an opportunity for the alternative media to be taken seriously when they do serious stories, as opposed to pretend that they don't exist. And if they do happen to come up with something really good, let's just pretend we found the information on our own. And I think that to me that's plagiarism. You
Yeah,
have to
yeah.
give credit to where the story comes from, and I've never had a problem doing that. But I can appreciate both. I think that there's some elements of mainstream media that we need to retain, but they need to embrace all of the best that is coming out of the alternative sphere as well.
Well, I wonder what it is when it comes to not wanting to mention. A friend of mine works at True North, Cosmin D'Souza, and he broke a story recently that CBC reported on, and he had to essentially badger CBC publicly for them to
Hmm.
admit that it was True North that gave it. I wonder, something that's really good about alternative media is that there's sort of a democracy element to it where anyone could do it. Anyone could, and any young person. I mean, we just hired a friend of mine at Post Millennial who I went to university with, and he's a younger guy. I think he's 20 years old. Doesn't really have a journalism degree, but it's just, I want to write, right? And I think that's a great thing, but I can't help but wonder if that is seen as, amateur,
Hmm.
when it comes to the mainstream. I mean, I wanted to ask you. You mentioned clickbait being one of the risks with alternative media. Would you consider deplatforming a risk? I mean, when you look at Rebel News,
Hmm.
just for an example, they just lost their YouTube channel, I think, or at
Hmm.
least I think it was demonetized. They were making, I think, $600,000 a year from that YouTube
Hmm.
channel, and now just in one fell swoop gone. So,
Yeah.
I think one of the issues there is scaling it in terms of big tech. I think over the years now we're at a point where big tech has recognized alternative media as almost as a threat, with the emergence of fake news, or what is determined to be fake news. um, it, the culture war that we're in, and I don't want to rant on here, but this culture war that we're in, is it really an information war?
I think you're right, and that's another element of my disillusionment with the mainstream media, is that Jack Dorsey doesn't have a journalism degree, nor does Sundar Pichai, nor does Tim Cook, nor does Mark Zuckerberg. So why is it that they are deciding what is a legitimate opinion or a legitimate perspective to be aired and what is not a legitimate opinion? Because part of what gets labeled fake news is just an alternative opinion. And one of the things that really struck me, if we want to talk about COVID, and this is why I worry about COVID creating a standard that's now going to apply to everything that is controversial or unpopular, because Sundar Pichai gave testimony saying YouTube will not print anything or will not allow a video that contradicts anything Dr. Anthony Fauci says. Well, cheapers, then you're going to have to censor the first half of what Anthony Fauci was making on decisions, because he didn't, he was
Yeah.
opposed to masks, and then he's in favor of masks. It was so that you have all kinds of changing rules that came about, but you have legitimate doctors being deplatformed as a result of that. So now I think we're now carrying forward one more step, right? That whatever Twitter or YouTube or Facebook decides they're going to censor, like what signal does that send to the mainstream media? Is oh my gosh, it must be so terrible. Even Twitter won't allow it. So do you think that the mainstream media is going to cover those stories? No, they're
No.
not.
Yeah.
And so you end up with the tech giants making the call about what journalism is. And that's not how it's supposed to be. So now you've got this second initiative coming up. I haven't followed it very closely to see how Post Millennial and others are going to be impacted. But the idea that Stephen Jabot is going to regulate the internet in the same way as the CRTC regulates mainstream broadcast media, that's is bananas. I don't even know how he thinks he can possibly do that. So I made the decision when I left Twitter and when I left mainstream to go on a different platform. I went on locals.com, which was a platform created by Dave Rubin, who's good friends with Jordan Peterson. And they both wanted to create platforms that allowed for genuine free speech. So it's hosted in America. The fees are paid in American dollars. You have to pay a small fee when you go on, so it prevents all the trolls from going on because you've got to have a legitimate name and a legitimate credit card. And it's like an all-in-one platform. It's like Twitter, if you want to do small clips, you can put longer posts like Facebook. You can post YouTubes, and they're also going to be expanding it out to do with live streaming. So they're creating an alternative media company that I think will be outside the reaches of meddling politicians. And so I have confidence that for every big tech censor, there's going to be an alternative, an equal and opposite reaction, if you will, of another new tech company that will come up and create a platform for those who want a broader range of discussion. And then it will be up to consumers to decide. And there'll be a portion of consumers that only want to hear from voices that are exactly like theirs and will only want to stay on those platforms that are progressive. But I think most people want to know the real deal. Most people trust their own judgment. Most people can see through something that's fake news and not legitimate, and then they can make their own minds up. And so I think that in the end, freedom of speech is going to prevail. That there will be technological solutions to this and new platforms that will resolve it. I think it's been a terrible year for freedom of speech and freedom of expression and all of our freedoms. And I think there's going to be a counter reaction to that. They've just gone too far.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. I mean, the legislation is definitely concerning to me. The idea that they want to regulate Canadian content and promote certain Canadian content over other content. That's the way they're framing it. That's the way the Heritage Minister is framing it. But it just gets to a point where, is the government just going to control YouTube now? Is YouTube going to comply with this? How does it affect the small, creator? How does it affect us, right? Are we not considered mainstream enough to be featured as Canadian content now? Is it just going to be CBC, which, typically has all dislikes on YouTube? I mean, it just makes you wonder to what degree is all of this malicious? I mean, without getting conspiratorial, why are there figures and individuals and groups that seek to censor you? I mean, I'm sure you've wondered about this before. Why, when you get hate mail or whatever you were dealing with, why is it that some people, either misled or intentionally, have it out for you so much? Why is it that some people interpret your words as a form of violence or inciting hatred? I mean, have you ever really stopped and wondered? Have you analyzed that? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I had 6 years in politics, and so I consider myself a fiscal conservative and more progressive on some of those hot button social and moral issues. And so I feel like I went through a lot of baptism by fire where I made a lot of mistakes. And so I'm very respectful in the way I speak to individuals who disagree with me. And so I think that is where we need to be. The idea that if somebody has an idea that you don't approve of, so you're going to try to listen with a pen in hand so that if they say one sentence that you can do a broadcast standard council complaint or start a boycott campaign against the sponsors. That's bizarre. Actually, that's kind of antisocial behavior, and it never used to happen back in the olden days, pre-social media. It seems to me that maybe the heart of the problem is Twitter, because when I think of all of the reputational damage that has been caused and the careers that have been ruined, it seems like it's those who say something that trends on Twitter. I mean, I haven't seen very many people misstep on Instagram and Facebook and
Yeah.
YouTube, although I suppose it happens. But Twitter somehow has more power than anything else, which is bizarre to me, because just quit Twitter then. Like, I had 41,000 followers. I just quit Twitter because it seems like Twitter has become an avenue for somebody who has any bit of profile to attract a bunch of trolls who are going to score a notch by tearing them down. And that's not a healthy environment to be in. You can opt out of it. I guess this is the question is, how important are those tech media? How important are they anyway? I mean, when I was starting in politics in 2009, I was trying to determine whether I should start a MySpace web site or a Facebook page. Like, that's how new the Facebook is. And so we used to be able to get our messages out and be creative without these three big, all dominating ways of communicating. Something else will come about. So I think there does need to be a bit of an opt-out campaign, a walk-away campaign from the most toxic forms of social media, so that we can create new forms. I think that there is almost no one, when I think of the interviews that I've done over the years, and I had, as I said, almost 6 years, 30 or more interviews a week. There were very, very few people that I did not find some common ground with. And I interviewed a full spectrum of individuals. There were very, very rare instances where I couldn't find something to agree with. And that's where we should begin. We should begin with thinking, is this person, who I know probably we disagree with on a range of issues, can I find something we agree on? And maybe it's because I grew up in a family of 5 kids, and my youngest brother is an animal rights activist vegan who doesn't own a car because he wants to reduce his carbon footprint. Like, he is the most progressive member of my family. And when you love your family, you find a way to talk to them about, from an interest of the things that you both care about. And so maybe it's because of my family dynamic, where we all love each other, even though we don't always get along and don't always agree. I broaden that out in my social relationships. I broaden that out in my media relationships. And I actually find it alarming that more people don't do that. I find it alarming that people allowed relationships to end or be disrupted because of whether you liked Donald Trump or hated Donald Trump. He's not even our darn president, for heaven's sakes. What, I mean, we can talk about it from the perspective of how his decisions influence Canada, but to have families break apart because of whether or not they liked the U.S. president is bananas to me. I can't imagine that there was a point in history where that has happened. So we've all gone a little bit nuts, and I think that there does need to be a bit of a dialing back about what's real. Twitter's not real. Social media is not real. The relationships and conversations you have with a real live person when you can see their eyeballs, that's what's real. And so if we can get to more of that, I think that the corrosive influence of social media will lessen, and we'll find better platforms.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have a theory. I have a conspiracy theory about Twitter, if you'll indulge me.
Do it.
So I think what it is the fact that it is over text, because you have a new platform emerging now in Clubhouse, which I don't know if you've heard of Clubhouse before.
I've not. Tell me about it.
So Clubhouse, it's very exclusive. You can't get in unless someone invites you to the app, which is a gimmick. But essentially, it is an audio-only room. So people could enter the room, and you'll have 4 or 5 people that are sort of panelists that are allowed to hear and talk, and you'll have 1,000 people that are just listening. And you can, promote people to be panelists and sort of play around with that. It's essentially one big, voice only phone call. And
it's like exclusive talk radio.
Exactly. And of course, this app comes out, everyone goes crazy over it. And Twitter and Facebook have immediately copied it. And now Twitter has something called Twitter Rooms. And Twitter Rooms is the exact same thing. Someone, to give you an example, right after the Conservative Convention, Andrew Lawton set up a Twitter room. And it was, you can just go in and you can talk and you can leave and you can come back and do whatever you want. And in that, there were people who were federal liberals and this is Twitter, who were talking with conservatives, and we were finding common ground and discussing policies, and you're just sort of hanging out in this phone call. And at some point, many people realized, wait a minute, this is Twitter. Like, if we're supposed to be hating each other, and yet when you're listening to someone over the phone, you don't want to yell at them so much. And certainly I would imagine in person that's accelerated, where would you send that tweet if the person was standing next to you in the elevator? Would you say that to their face? Certainly not, right? So I wonder to what degree it's wholly unnatural to humans to be partaking in something like Twitter, which isn't reality. And when people are dealing with getting canceled, for example, you get really misled into thinking, these 12 people somehow represent a wider population when
Hmm.
it's really just, the 12 usual suspects on Twitter that are attacking you.
You're onto something there, and I don't know what it is. Maybe you can interview somebody who's an expert in how the brain works or psychology,
Yeah.
because when you think about our whole history as human beings, how we've related to each other, we started off all as oral societies, and so you have to imagine that the spoken word is the most powerful way of making human connection. And there probably is something to that, because we realize as human creatures that the only way we would survive and not starve to death is to form social groups where we could first hunt and then farm and then build societies. So there's something really powerful about the spoken word that I think does cut through that. And so what is the equivalent, if you look historically, of 140 character texts? I mean, do we have anything like
No,
that, really? I
not
mean,
really.
even when we moved to the written word, it was more sitting down with a pen and paper in hand and learning a script and writing a long form letter, which again is a very different part of your brain that you use. So there's got to be something. I wonder if the part of the brain that can type is maybe too closely connected to that animal part of our brain, the alligator brain, where it's too emotional or something. But there is something very inhuman and very impersonal about texting that is at the root of the problem. You're completely right. I wonder if I don't know if emails had quite the same corrosive effect on relationships that Twitter does, but the combination is deadly. And you know what? Look, if Twitter is able to copy rooms and they're able to create a more healthy forum with an audio forum, then perhaps that'll spill over onto the
Yeah.
texting side. I mean, I think I don't wish for companies to fail, but companies who are causing net social harm, I don't think should succeed. I shouldn't be cheering them
Hmm.
on. So if they're going to be acting in a corrosive way, then they deserve to fail and something deserves to take their place.
Hmm. Certainly when they're sort of virtue signaling that they're actually helping the world instead of actually
Mm.
damaging it. But to get to my next point, I wanted to ask a little bit more about you. And I wanted to sort of pick your brain on curiosity, because
Hmm.
a lot of the reason why I got into this at a very basic level is I just like talking to people who are interesting, and I'm just curious. And that gets you in trouble, apparently. That I'm willing to talk to, crazy people. Not that you're crazy, by the way. I'm not saying you're one of those
Oh
crazy people,
no!
but I'm saying if there's someone who's really, colorful, I want to talk to that person when everyone's running away to,
Hmm.
at the crazy naked guy off the side of the street. I'm sort of curious. And, you know, like I've noticed even recently, you've interviewed Pastor James Coates. Like
Hmm.
you've always been interested and curious in talking to people. Where does that come from? Because I don't know if that's necessarily a conservative trait.
Hmm. Funny you should say that. When I was in politics, my staff said, Danielle, you have no crazy radar. Because I couldn't really tell when somebody wanted to approach me to talk about an issue if they might have been a little unhinged or a little conspiratorial. I tend to give people the benefit of the doubt. And that can be dangerous in the media world that you're in, is that if you're talking to somebody who says something that is truly out there, then you can become tarnished with that. And so what has occurred is that rather than trying to seek to understand where the common ground is, those voices just get pushed out into the outer reaches, and so we don't hear from them at all. And so I think that there's a value in even understanding those who have views that are outside the conventional mainstream. It's important to talk to them. Albert Einstein had views that were outside the conventional mainstream at one point. And and anyone who has come up with any breakthrough in their area of research is almost always an outlier. And they had to do a lot of work to try to convince the mainstream to come on board with them. And so to me, that's where the interesting ideas are. Maybe it's because I love entrepreneurship so much. When I was in high school, I got introduced to junior achievement. So that was my first opportunity of making a product out of nothing. It wasn't a very good product. It was little dough creatures called lumpies. My mom and dad ended up having to buy a lot of them because they didn't sell very well. But I think my early introduction to entrepreneurship made me realize that it's really those disruptors that have changed the world. Think of all of the incredible inventions we've seen in the last 100 years. That's somebody who came up with an idea out of nowhere. So I think that this is an opportunity. I'm going to make it work, and they just stuck with it. So it's odd to me that we have a society that wants conformity. We have a society that wants to create things, keep things exactly as they are. But our social progress and our entrepreneurial and free enterprise progress has always been because of outliers. It's always been because people see the world a different way. And if we don't allow those people to flourish and for those people to have a platform, what are the ideas and innovations that we're going to miss out on? Not every idea is going to be brilliant, but 1 in 1,000 will, and 1 in 1,000 will change the world. And that's why it's so important that you always talk to people across a full broad range of perspectives, because you never know which somebody who seems like they're a lunatic might end up turning out to be a genius.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good that's a good high note to leave things, but where can people find more about you? I know you're on Locals, so please go support Danielle on Locals. What else are you up to?
So daniellesmith.ca is my website. I decided to just create a subscriber newsletter. So I'm on newsletter number 15. So anyone can sign up to my newsletter, and I send my thoughts out each week. I don't post them anywhere because I'm not really interested in having anything go viral. But if people are interested in what I have to say, I'm more than happy to send them a copy. Follow me on daniellesmith.locals.com. That's the other place where I get commentary that I put up, and interesting clips and interesting stories every day. And I've also started a new job. I'm the president of the Alberta Enterprise Group because, as I mentioned, I love entrepreneurs, and there's just so much entrepreneurial talent in Alberta. And I think we're just set to rocket ship here. And I want to be a part of telling those incredible stories.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on.
You bet. My pleasure.
All right, that was Danielle Smith. You can find her work at daniellesmith.locals.com, where you can also support her work. Let me know what you thought. I thought this was a really interesting conversation with someone who's really been embedded in mainstream media and in politics for, quite a while. So it's interesting to get that insight, especially as someone who is basically on the outside in alternative media. If you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please follow, please share. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe. It's much appreciated. Until next time, I'm Angelo Sidoro. If you like that video and want to see more, please make sure to subscribe to the Post Millennial. For daily news and content, please go to thepostmillennial.com and consider becoming a member. For $5 a month, you can get rid of all the advertisements on the site. If you like what I'm wearing on my head, you can go to shop.postmillennial.com, where we have beanies, mugs, and t-shirts. Please consider supporting the Post Millennial however you can. It's massively appreciated. Thank you.